What does it mean to be an American? I live here. I work here. I pay taxes here. I am not going anywhere. So when do I get to be free?
That quote from civil rights organizer Ella Baker cut straight to the heart of today's episode. Welcome back to APUSH for All. Today we're telling a longer, richer, and more connected story of the civil rights movement. We're going to push beyond the familiar dates like 1954 to 1968, and instead we're going to try to look at the long arc of this movement, where it came from, how it evolved, who led it, and how it still echoes in our world today.
We'll connect themes of power, protest, identity, and we'll look back at the failures of Reconstruction, how the betrayals of Jim Crow and the persistence of Black resistance continued throughout. We're going to explore landmark legislation and the grassroots struggles, and we'll amplify voices often left out of the traditional narrative.
We'll also challenge the notion of a neat linear movement. I know this has happened to you guys in my classes probably just this last week when I asked them, give me a beginning and an end time for the civil rights movement and give me some high points. Here's what you usually get. Here's what I got. Basically, 54 to 68. Mm-hmm. And the two people that will always come up are Dr. King and Rosa Parks. Right. And I know that's probably a common occurrence in your classes. It's because the story of civil rights in America is not linear. It is messy. It's shaped by disagreement, radical ideas, cautious legal strategies, generational divides, and persistent injustice.
Okay, let's start our story where most textbooks don't. The betrayal of Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, we've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which promised abolition, equal protection, and voting rights for Black men. But by 1877, with the compromise that ultimately ended Reconstruction and removed federal troops from the South, the government now has kind of left the South to its own devices, and it's not long before Jim Crow rears its ugly head and segregation becomes the law of the land.
Yeah, and this Jim Crow led to lynchings, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all structures of white supremacy. Not only were they violently enforced, but they were actually legalized. And so 1896, the famous court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, this gives the green light for federal segregation across the nation as long as facilities were separate but equal. However, we know that rarely, if at any time, were they equal. However, despite all of this, Black Americans resisted, not just through lawsuits, but through education, community building, journalism, and organizing.
Speaking of journalism, journalist Ida B. Wells, for example, led an anti-lynching crusade in the 1890s, documenting the brutality with facts and fearlessness. She once said this: "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." Her work laid the foundation for investigative journalism and was a forerunner to the activism of the civil rights era.
Yeah, and moving into the 20th century then, between World War I and World War II, Black Americans continued to push for civil rights and equality. The Great Migration, which started around 1915, a little bit before the United States entered World War I and continuing through the 1940s, was one of the most significant demographic shifts in American history, where over 1.5 million African Americans left the rural South in the first wave alone, fleeing Jim Crow laws, racial violence, and economic exploitation that had been happening for centuries at this point.
Right, and this wasn't just a change of scenery for fun here. This was all about changing power. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and New York, you had these Black communities that began to coalesce and build these independent institutions, strong institutions like churches, newspapers, labor unions, these political clubs. Northern cities weren't by any means free of racism, but these Black migrants found opportunities for work and education and political organizing that just weren't available to them in the South during Jim Crow.
Harlem. I always have to like work in some kind of like, trumpet noise. You guys know that. Yeah. So boom, you've got this cultural and intellectual mecca. Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and early 30s wasn't just about art and music, however. It was a movement of Black self-definition. Writers like Langston Hughes declared, "I too sing America." Zora Neale Hurston wrote folklore and novels that celebrated Black Southern life. And James Weldon Johnson, an NAACP leader and poet, pushed both beauty and activism.
Yeah, and this cultural reawakening or cultural awakening also brought sharper political critique, especially as Black veterans returned from World War I, expecting full citizenship after the valor and bravery that they had shown in Europe. They were met with violence. And after World War I in 1919, during the Red Summer, white mobs attacked Black communities in dozens of cities. And a little bit before the Red Summer of 1919, East St. Louis, which is right across the river from us, and St. Louis had one of the nation's largest, racial incidents, and we'd probably call it a massacre.
Massacre.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's been a lot of for a long time it was called the riot, but in actuality, it was more of a massacre.
Right. Tulsa is another example of that. Chicago. So, in response to all of this, new leadership voices like A. Philip Randolph, who was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, began calling for mass protests, economic justice, and federal intervention to do something about all of this. So the Great Migration wasn't just a movement of people, it was more of a movement of possibility, one that laid the groundwork for everything that would come in what we typically think of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. New coalitions, new forms of protest, new political muscle. Black Americans, by changing where they lived, changed the terms of the national conversation.
And at the same time, you see the rise of groups like the NAACP and the National Urban League, which had, they focused on legal strategies and social uplift, but they were also opening the doors for working class activists and even communists who were fighting for labor and civil rights. I mean, for an African American in the 1920s and 30s, communism, at least as an ideology, which spoke about the people owning power and power distributed equally, that sounds like a pretty powerful idea. Especially when it's juxtaposed against the capitalism of the South that they were so used to. You had women like Mary McLeod Bethune, who built institutions like the National Council of Negro Women, who served as a bridge between Black communities and the New Deal, which had just been introduced by FDR.
Then came World War II. African Americans fought in segregated units as they had done in World War I. Won't be desegregated until Truman does that in 1948.
Well, and in World War I, African Americans weren't even allowed to fight in American units. They were actually put into mostly French units. So the United States wouldn't even recognize their military service.
And the amount of adoration that you see from not just French commanders, French soldiers, but the French people about the heroism that was displayed by Black American soldiers. They experienced that, and they didn't get that same adoration, if you want to call it that, from their own ranks.
Exactly, and I'm glad you mentioned that because we didn't really speak on this too much when we talked about the lost generation. But during that same time period, jazz becomes the most popular music in France. And Paris actually becomes an international capital of jazz music because so many Black soldiers, Black American soldiers said, hey, why would I go back to the United States when I'm treated as a second-class citizen where I could stay here in France and be welcomed as an equal? They had their own nightclubs that they were no longer having to play for segregated audiences. They were celebrated as artists and musicians. And so you really have a strong Black African-American core in Paris that a lot of people don't even really realize was ever there in the first place.
And there was that, I think it was that recognition and that realization that when these guys were putting their lives on the line, that the Double V campaign really kind of comes into its own. So, to your point, Dr. Garrison, victory against fascism abroad, yes, but also victory against racism when we return. And so that contradiction is captured, and for all intents and purposes, when we ask that question in class, when did the civil rights movement begin? There are a myriad of different events or years that you can talk about, but this is certainly a big part of that.
Yeah, I always talk in class. I know you guys say something similar, but the paradox of American history has been with us from the beginning. We're a nation of freedom and a nation of slavery. And this really comes to a head in the Double V campaign. And you can see that as really maybe one of the major starting points of the civil rights movement.
Well, and the fascists used that against the United States. Specifically, Nazi Germany really called
Mhm.
out the contradictions of the United States to really tried to weaponize it against the United States.
Yeah, as did the Japanese when the Japanese Empire warned its citizens of the dangers of allowing these Westerners to infiltrate their realm of power. One of their strongest arguments was, if you want to know what's going to happen if the Americans take hold here, look how they treated Native Americans and African Americans in their own communities. And that's a good idea of what we may face in the future. The modern civil rights movement officially kicks off with, of course, the Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that, in a unanimous decision, ruled segregated public schools were unconstitutional. But, as we know, Brown didn't magically desegregate schools.
Right, these things have to be enforced, and Southern states resisted with massive resistance. And meanwhile, in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, a teenager named Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat to a white woman. Months after that, a name we all, recognize in American history, Rosa Parks, who was trained at the Highlander Folk School, did the same. And as a result, the Montgomery bus boycott began. And something that I really like to emphasize with both of these women, Claudette Colvin, who we don't often hear a lot about, Rosa Parks kind of takes the spotlight here, but both of these people were extremely well educated in tactics of nonviolent resistance and nonviolent direct action. And I think to portray, especially Rosa Parks, as just simply a tired seamstress really takes away from her power and, her bravery as an activist.
Right, making a conscious decision to put herself in this position. It's really a remarkable story that oftentimes students don't ever really hear. But in fact, for over a year, thousands of Black residents, and especially in this case, women who were working as domestic laborers, as servants, they would walk miles to work each day. Famously, you have Joanne Robinson of the Women's Political Council, and she had really laid this groundwork. You can't just overnight convince people to be a part of something like this. It takes effort, organizing, and careful strategizing. It wasn't spontaneous at all. It was clearly orchestrated.
Very organized, and it's something that we emphasize in class as well is the grassroots infrastructure that has to be in place for these things to happen. And then, not to discredit or take away anything that Martin Luther King Jr. did, but oftentimes he would be flown in to serve as kind of the face of whatever crisis needed to be tangled with at the time. But it's the nameless, faceless people that people are unfamiliar with that are doing this. So Rosa Parks later said this: "I would like to be remembered as a person who wanted to be free, so other people would also be free." Her quiet dignity was radical, especially in a world where Black women were expected to suffer in silence.
Yeah, dignity is a key part of the civil rights movement, and something that, people of color had been denied, since 1619, you could say, with the first slave ship arriving off the coast of Virginia. So, We really need to talk about the brutality of this decade because while legal strategies were being tested in court, Black children and families faced really deadly violence just simply for existing. And in 1955, just months before Rosa Parks' arrest, Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, was kidnapped, tortured, and lynched while visiting family in Mississippi after allegedly whistling at a white woman in a store. And his killers were acquitted by an all-white jury.
Right, and this is after his killers publicly admitted to the crime, but knew when they did so that they would be getting away with it scot-free. That's how confident they were in the system that they benefited from. So maybe one of the most shocking moments in the course of the civil rights story is when Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Moby, made this decision that changed history. She demanded an open casket funeral, and this despite the fact that her son was horribly disfigured, had been terribly beaten, and almost looked inhuman to some degree. That was how vicious of an attack that was laid upon him. But she said, quote, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." Photos of Till's mutilated body were then published in Jet Magazine and the Chicago Defender, and collectively, this story shocked the nation and began galvanizing activists all across the country.
It's that power of image, right? That moment where Emmett's face becomes a spark. Muhammad Ali, John Lewis, and even Rosa Parks later said his death was a turning point. It reminded the country that racial violence wasn't just a relic of the past. It was happening now. And I know that we got the opportunity to experience the African American Museum in DC, and the separate room that they have set up as the Emmett Till room. And it's such a you're drained, you're emotionally exhausted when you walk out of the room because it's just the power, the spirituality of that place, and you can see how impactful this would have been back then.
Yeah, and they have Emmett Till's original casket in that room, and it's just above eye level. And it's opened, and then inside is a picture of his face from when he, at his funeral, so disfigured, and it's so powerful because you can't quite see unless you kind of stand on your tiptoes, and it's very intentionally done and very thoughtful and powerful. And it's the only room I think in the whole museum where you can't take pictures for good reason because it's a place of great reverence. So the resistance kept growing. By 1957, 9 Black students who would be known as the Little Rock Nine enrolled at Central High School in Arkansas. They were met by angry mobs, state resistance, and physical threats when they tried to walk into the school to desegregate it. And President Eisenhower eventually sent federal troops, not necessarily out of a deep commitment to civil rights, but to enforce this federal law.
Right, and this is one of the beginning moments when the civil rights movement forces an American president to respond, and that was the whole goal, right? And it mattered to have these images of young students being screamed at, harassed as they entered school. It showed, number one, the courage that it took for these students just to go to school on a daily basis, but it also brought, again, that national attention to what was happening in the American South. Elizabeth Eckford, one of the 9 students, walked alone through the mob, and famously she did so in a very stoic way, despite the fact that a white woman was screaming behind her. And that image is probably one of the more powerful that comes out of this time period.
Yeah, and so by the end of the 1950s, we're seeing 2 things: a series of legal precedents that are being established and a really powerful grassroots movement forming. It's led by churchgoers, mothers, students, college students, high school students, people who refused to wait any longer for justice.
The 1960s brought the rise of a number of powerful organizations. SCLC under Martin Luther King, SNCC, led by the young activists Diane Nash, Ella Baker, and famously John Lewis, as well as the burgeoning sit-in movement, which, although had begun earlier, really takes root in Greensboro, North Carolina, and from there it quickly spread.
Maybe, Dr. Garrison, we should say the full names of the.
Yeah, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then SNCC is a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yeah, and Ella Baker was critical of top-down leadership. She believed, as she said, strong people don't need strong leaders. Under her mentorship, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, promoted grassroots organizing, which really emphasized local empowerment over celebrity.
And you got that in the Freedom Rides that began in 1961. This group of both black and white, mostly college students that tested federal rulings that had outlawed segregation at interstate bus terminals. So integrated groups of young activists, black and white, rode buses into the Deep South. And what they encountered was nothing short of horrifying. Beatings in Birmingham, a bus that was firebombed outside of Anniston, Alabama, and violent mobs that met with police indifference or collaboration.
And America watched, for the first time, millions of Americans, they weren't just reading about racial injustice in the paper, they were actually seeing it in real time on their televisions in their living rooms. And this is a time where more people have TVs than they have refrigerators. So TV becomes so important, and that was part of the movement. Was that is the strategy of nonviolent direct action, is to create this crisis and to showcase how unjust these laws were, these segregation laws, and to test them and to show to America and show to the world how horrible this was. And by 1963, the city of Birmingham became a national flashpoint. This was considered the most segregated city in the entire country. Police commissioner, his name was Bull Connor. He turned fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful child protesters, which has now become the Children's March. And those images, they were shocking, undeniable, and they were broadcast nightly to the country. These really forced Americans, especially white Americans outside of the South, to confront the brutal realities of Jim Crow.
And Ms. Callan, I'm glad you pointed this out. It's important for us to recognize just how instrumental technology would be to this movement. We always say, kind of jokingly, that history repeats itself, right? And it's not so much that history repeats itself, but we see these same patterns emerge. Technology is always a driving force, and how people utilize that technology often plays a major role in how history will shape out, right? So television becomes this really powerful household technology. By 1965, over 90% of households have access to TVs, and civil rights activists took advantage of this. They knew that cameras were rolling. They knew that they had this wider audience that they could reach out to thanks to this brand new technology. So in one sense, technology becomes an activist ally, right? It's this witness for the rest of the world, and it helps a nonviolent resistance really take off.
I'm really sorry that I stole your thunder on the TV. I clearly didn't read.
I think I covered for it pretty well.
You did, and this is really important. We just talked about this today in class. The idea of a passive resistance is really not passive if what you are hoping to do is to elicit some kind of violent response, and knowing that cameras will be rolling and they will catch that. So it won't matter if you live in Massachusetts, you know what is happening in Mississippi that day. Mm-hmm. That's powerful.
So after the March on Washington and King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, is this moment of seemingly victory, right? You've got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlaws segregation in public places. It banned discrimination in employment. And then the following year, you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which followed the Selma marches and the Bloody Sunday, where activists like John Lewis were brutalized on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
But these victories, it doesn't end the civil rights movement, but they mark a pivot, because urban uprisings in places like Watts in California in 1965, Detroit in 1967, and Newark, New Jersey in 1967 showed frustration with inequality that couldn't be fixed by legal change alone. And so the federal government sets up this commission to investigate this called the Kerner Commission, which famously concluded, and I quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal."
And people are losing their patience. So while Dr. King spoke out against Vietnam and poverty in his final years, there were younger activists that were growing impatient. People from SNCC and the newly formed Black Panther Party embraced the concept of Black power.
Yeah, and I think it's here that we really need to mention the complexity and the other currents of Black resistance that existed alongside of and at times in contention with King and his nonviolent direct action. So while Dr. King is often remembered as the face of the civil rights movement, he certainly was not the only voice and certainly not the only strategy. So many African Americans, especially those living in the urban North, were really growing frustrated with the slow legal progress and that had been made with nonviolent protest. They were still facing poverty, housing discrimination, and police brutality even after the Civil Rights Act and things like the Voting Rights Act of '65.
So enter Malcolm X, formerly Malcolm Little. A former member of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X rose to national prominence in the early 60s with a message that was unapologetic, uncompromising, and deeply rooted in Black self-determination. He rejected the idea that Black people needed to prove their humanity through suffering. I always see, when we talk about Dr. King and we talked about Malcolm X, we always have the conversation. We revert back to people like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, being forerunners in that same conversation. And so here's what Malcolm X said: "Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery." And that's not something that you're hearing out of Dr. King's mouth.
Right. And I mean, this quote captures his rhetorical stance. And it is true that he was not willing to kind of sit back and wait on white society to accept him. He was ready to move forward and be proud of Black society as it was. It didn't need to become something else. But still, it's important not to flatten Malcolm into a caricature of violence. His core message was about dignity, the word that Ms. Keltner used earlier, right? He just had a different way of getting at it. He argued that African Americans should stop looking to white America for some type of validation or acceptance, and instead he emphasized this idea of Black nationalism, Black self-respect, economic independence, and international human rights.
Yeah, and he also understood geography. He really pointed out the nuances of racism and that it looked a lot different in the North than it could look in the South. Because in the North, it was subtler, right? It was wrapped up in things like housing covenants, which were discriminatory, things like we would call redlining today, and discriminatory policing, rather than, in the South, obvious signs that were implementing Jim Crow segregation. And this message, this made his message resonate with urban Black audiences in places like Harlem, Oakland, and Detroit.
His famous phrase, "by any means necessary," became a rallying cry for those who believed the movement needed to go beyond moral persuasion. He was deeply critical of integrationist approaches, saying at one point, quote, "You don't integrate with a sinking ship. You get your own lifeboat," unquote.
Right. And it's important, though, for us to also note that Malcolm X evolved in the same way that Martin Luther King evolved. After breaking with the Nation of Islam in 1964, he went on to found his own Muslim Mosque, Inc., and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He traveled to Mecca, met Muslims of all races, and began rethinking some of his earlier views so that when he returned to the United States, he had a much broader, more internationalist vision of collective human rights. And toward the end of his life, he even expressed openness to working with Dr. King.
Yeah, and that complexity, it gets lost in the way that Malcolm X is sometimes portrayed. He wasn't just a foil or an opposite to King. He was a visionary in his own right. And when he was assassinated in 1965, he was only 39. And that is so young, but his legacy lived on through younger activists and an emerging Black Power movement.
So we should note here that we definitely are going to come back and talk about 1968 and the countercultural movement and what Dr. King's assassination means for the civil rights movement and also just the broader uh, rights movements that were going on at the same time. But for now, let's just ask this question: where does all this leave us today? I mean, we could talk about voter suppression, mass incarceration, racial profiling. I think we can see these as battlegrounds of the 21st century civil rights struggle.
Yeah, and movements like Black Lives Matter, which started after the killing of Trayvon Martin, are often called the new civil rights movement, but really, they're just the latest chapter in a very old story.
And in 2020, millions marched after George Floyd's murder. The echo of Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and Malcolm X rang out in those streets.
One of the most powerful through lines through all of this is that the real change is not just made up by presidents and courts, but it's ordinary Americans, ordinary people organizing, risking, and showing up.
So let's bring this back to, APUS, the course. This movement intersects with units 8 and 9 and themes about social structures, identity, politics, and power. It illustrates a lot of continuity, but also change, especially in terms of racial justice, constitutional rights, and public activism.
So for sure on the AP exam, you're going to get possibly an SAQ on the Civil Rights Act, a DBQ on the evolution of civil rights strategies, or possibly an LEQ comparing Reconstruction with the modern civil rights movement.
But beyond the test, here's the takeaway. This movement was never just about laws. It was about dignity, visibility, and voice. And it continues.
As we begin to wrap up, we would like to thank our sponsors.
Junior Java, a student-led coffee and tea company with a mission to make education more equitable worldwide. Every purchase helps support kids in need. Fuel your studies and support a great cause. Check out juniorjavacoffee.com to shop and learn more.
Thanks, Junior Java, for keeping us and history brewing.
Also, a big thanks to Cats and Family Dentistry, Scrawny Arms Farm, the Healthcare Group for Women, and Right on Ruben Schlansky College Essay Tutoring. As always, we are honored by their support.
All right, that's it. Thanks for tuning in to APUSH for All. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Leave us a review if you'd like. And if you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
It's good to be back, guys, after our little break from spring break.
This feels good.
Yeah, refreshing.
Yeah. Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.